at ya, at ya. Tell you what's master, coming at ya, coming at ya. Rhyme style disaster, coming at ya, at ya. Tell you what's master.
All right, welcome to yet another scintillating episode of Cut the Bull. After some audience comments, I may wear a jacket for the next one, but I may not. I'm here today with my lovely and talented co-host Brooks Crenshaw, as well as the other person who fits that bill, Christy Kelly. And today we're interviewing Peter Moskos, who's one of the voices on policing in the USA that I think a lot of us in kind of sane academia have found pretty reasonable. He's got quite a lot of publications out there. We're going to discuss some of them, including the work in defense of flogging, but we're going to focus on his more recent texts. So, Peter, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's good to be here. Had I known it was video, I would have worn a jacket.
Yeah. It doesn't really matter. I mean, I used to wear suits for all my Zoom appearances, but it got kind of tiring. I mean, I don't think I'm going to be beautiful regardless of the background. I don't think I'm going to be absolutely hideous either. So I just rocked the gym clothes. But I guess I'll ask the first question, and then we'll go around the panel. So, I mean, obviously, I've looked up some of your background. Your father, I believe, was Charles Moskos, well-known writer in the U.S. social sciences. So, can you kind of break down like what led you into sort of academic work, and what led you to focus on policing specifically? Were you a cop for a period of time, or?
Uh, I was a cop in Baltimore City briefly from 1999 to 2001, but it was unusual for many reasons, not the least of which is because I was a Harvard graduate student in sociology at the time. So I went there for the purpose of conducting my PhD research. Only became a cop because my research was disapproved after I arrived because of politics. And then I stayed till I got civil service protection, and then finished school. And it was a brief time in some rough streets, but honestly, I banked my career on those 20 months. I could not have written Back from the Brink without that trust that, hey, maybe he wasn't a cop for long, but at least he walked a mile in my shoes. But to go back a bit further, yeah, both my parents were teachers. My father was a professor, and it's interesting how closely I follow in his footsteps. He was a military sociologist, and in effect, I'm not in a sociology department anymore, thank God. But in effect, I'm a police sociologist, and my mom is still alive, and she was a high school teacher of German and Spanish. So I always saw a decent lifestyle in academia. Summers off, you don't get rich, but that's okay. I got a good life, and I got into the policing game in large part because of the crime drop in New York City that I, finally get to write about 30 years later. Um, I started grad school in '95. Murders in New York are plummeting, and all the experts in the field say that's impossible because we haven't, because police. I mean, this is their supposed truism, which is false. Policing don't impact crime. We have to fix society and end poverty and racism and all the other so-called root causes, which I don't want to disparage too much because those are important: education and healthcare and poverty, but violence was cut first, 50%, then another 50%, and we didn't fix any of those root causes. We don't have to. It was in large part policing. So I wanted to tell that story of what happened. And so that's what I've really been working on for the past 10 years. I'm almost ashamed to admit how long the book took from first interview to now.
It's good work. I've read the book, but I mean, I'm actually going to deflect from the question I was going to ask and ask one more, than move to Christy. But you brought up something that's really kind of, I think, obvious to anyone who watches the American social sciences, which is that people say a lot of things that objectively sound crazy. The example I usually use is men can be women at will, but there's not even a reason to open that conversation. I mean, what you just said is right up there. Like, policing doesn't affect crime. So, like, to stop crime, you would have to literally eliminate racism or something like that. And at some level, that might stop crime. But in the intermediate world that humans exist in, like the unheavenly city, it seems really obvious that if you take someone who's a rapist and you kill him, the rapes will stop. If you throw him in jail, this will have almost the same effect. How could anyone deny that? And why do so many academics deny that kind of thing?
The why is a good question, and I have thought about that a lot, and I don't have a good answer, and I, don't want to pretend I can read other people's minds. I think a lot of it has to do with uncomfortable racial disparities in terms of violent crime, or you don't want to blame the criminal. Um, some of it has to do with, the way they were taught. For a lot of these academics, crime is in the abstract, it happens. And then you get a little theory. I mean, academics love theory, and it goes back to the 68 Presidential Commission on Crime that I don't know if it invented the theory, but it certainly popularized, laid out the idea that police are the problem. They're agents of racial repression. And it was a big study with lots of authors. I'm oversimplifying, but that was a gist of it was police are the problem that we need to rein in, and society and the ills of society cause people to become criminals. So fix society, criminals don't get blamed, and police are the problem. And that's just kind of, I mean, it's still there today. That hasn't gone away, but it's been with us for over 50 years now, probably longer.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's a whole world, I mean, in academic history going back to people like Franz Boas that argued that everything any group did was the most brilliant possible reaction to the environment it lived in. No one could ever be bad. No one's ever responsible for anything. I mean, I think this is all just bullshit. But Christy Kelly, what do you
If I
think?
could
What
just
are
say, if I could say one more thing quickly about that, is what bothers me about it is it denies people's agency fundamentally. It's always about how people react to other things, and the people have no control. And there's something so damn patronizing about that. Anyway.
That's a really good point, especially if we're talking about like black or poor white or whatever communities. The idea is they can't do anything without us coming in as the anointed. Well, that's Tom's soul, right? Milton Friedman, like the anointed and the benighted. Like we've got to show these poor bastards how to have sex, literally, if you look at high school education and how to fight. I mean, I don't know. I don't believe that's necessary. But Christy Kelly, what do you think?
I mean, I guess I have a burning question, not to, take us down a tangent, but here in Phoenix or in Arizona where I'm at, the Maricopa Sheriff's Office, it's not a consent decree, but it's under federal authority. They've been under federal authority since Joe Arpaio days, right? So way too long, costing, millions and millions of dollars to be under this federal control. The city of Phoenix, they just did a study and they wanted to put it under a consent decree. Well, Trump canceled it. So the Biden administration said, yeah, consent decree. Trump canceled it, so there's not going to be a consent decree for the city of Phoenix police. Does federal authority work? Do these consent decrees work, or do they do more harm ultimately?
Ultimately, I think it's a mild net harm. That is, I think they've look. Federal government has been. First of all, I find it interesting how it became a left-right divide. Like I could easily imagine a world in which the right wing loved consent decrees to take over these departments, but somehow it became aligned with the progressive side of the Democratic Party. It's really hard to get out of them. There's a industry around it. There's money there,
Hmm.
decades and decades, and we don't. I mean, yeah. So where's the great success story? Now there might be some. I don't think they've all failed, but when I hear it's a boilerplate template to get under in the consent decree. So basically, the Department of Justice would churn them out, showing, well, asserting systemic racism, and then the city would sign off on it. I think it might have improved policing in Baltimore, uh, because it did two positive things. It forced them to put more money into training, uh, and then in 2020, when the defund movement happened, a judge simply said, "That's off the table. You can't defund." And Baltimore is one of the few cities that did not see a huge rise in violence in 2020, though they saw one 5 years before in 2015. But I think with fewer consent decrees is better. I can imagine a case where there's something so egregious it's needed, but I don't see them being implemented in that way.
Yeah, I definitely think I was in LA when the city of Torrance was under a consent decree. I was living there, and Torrance was notorious. I mean, I lived in Redondo Beach, and you had to pass through Torrance, and I would literally tell people that were coming to see me, you may not want to come at a certain time of night if
Was
aren't
Torrance that
aren't
famous bankrupt city?
no, 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 it
Oh,
wasn't.
okay.
But it was notorious for their horrible policing. They even pulled my father over late one night. He was coming, I was sick, he was coming to see me. LA traffic's horrible, so he was leaving at 4 in the morning to go home, and they pulled him over. Just, what are you doing? Why are you here? Do you have somebody that lives here, right? I never got pulled over, probably because my tags were located there, but a consent decree went in, and my idea is for the price that the city and the state has to pay, the cities and the states can take care, I think, of their own policing if they have a mind to do so, whether they're conservative or Democrat. I think for the
Yeah.
most part, for the price tag.
It's a bit like hiring, I think, any consulting company. You hire McKinsey and they come in and they tell you what know you need to do, but you sort of, for whatever reason, you weren't able to do it. So consent decrees can do that. I think a lot of focus needs to be placed on these smaller departments. That's often where the problems are, but usually they fly under the radar because they're small. But there also has to be a system where the incentives are to get out of the consent decree and not perpetuate it forever, and that's where that money comes in. Um, it's
Yeah,
certainly
if
not
I
an efficient use of funds.
Yeah, if I could jump in briefly there, actually, I wrote a paper on policing with Bob Moranto about a year and a half ago, which is the only time I've ever really jumped into that field. And we looked at the police departments that killed the fewest unarmed people, basically, but also were able to keep murder down to pretty low levels. And I was surprised. The two best police departments were New York and Chicago. And that was something that I was very surprised to find, actually, because I mean, you think of those cities as kind of Sodom-like giant places with people camped outside and so on. That wasn't at all the case, actually. The worst police departments were Little Rock, Arkansas, that kind of thing, like Memphis. So they were departments in mid-sized cities that often kind of let the officers not do what they wanted, but hadn't exactly been pursuing like up-to-date best practices, that sort of thing. And of the back end of the list was all that Charleston, West Virginia, Memphis, Little Rock, so on down the line, mostly heavily
There,
black or poor white communities.
I looked into that back when that was the big issue between 2015 and 2020. There was a strong pattern, particularly those cities, medium-sized cities west of the Mississippi: Albuquerque, Oklahoma City, Bakersfield, Riverside, Tulsa. They're off the like their rates were rates of cops shooting and killing people were 10 times that of New York City. Now
Mhm.
there are reasons for that, but at some point you go, really? Something's not right here. But it was also interesting. Most of those cities, not all the ones you mentioned, had very low percentages of black population, and I kind of think because because other people living there just didn't care. If there wasn't a race element to it, a lot of Hispanics were disproportionately impacted. But it was low hanging fruit. Instead, people are out protesting Minneapolis, Seattle, New York. I mean, the NYPD by quantifiable measures was doing a great job, but then cops murdered a man in Minnesota, so we had to tear it all down.
Yeah. And I mean, I actually think because I mean, this is a pretty like open conversation podcast. I mean, I'm not entirely sure the attitude they have in Charleston, West Virginia from white officers or Memphis from black officers is incorrect. I mean, so when you say the police shooting rate is 5 times as high as it is in NYC, I mean, it's still quite low. So the idea that people don't really care about criminals getting shot by the police actually strikes me as pretty healthy. I mean, the sort of extreme fanaticism about this over the past 30, 40 years. I mean, do any of you know when the fleeing felon rule was abandoned? And we got like two, three lawyers on the panel.
Yeah, Tennessee versus Gardner in '83, but it was departmentally departments that got rid of it usually before then.
No, I mean that's good.
I'm not
I
a lawyer,
suppose
by the
we're all
way,
supposed to
but it is my
conventionally say
field.
that's good. But like until 1985 almost, if someone was running from the police and a felony crime was suspected, you could just shoot them. And that had been the rule for all of human
Mhm.
history, if you look at Indian, Chinese, early American law. So, I mean, I think that our extreme focus on the well-being of criminals in the United States is kind of new and unusual. And Peter, I think you're probably right that there's a big race element. So, like in poor white communities or Hispanic communities, there's also a very high crime rate. But I don't think that the reason I'm bringing people up racially is I don't notice in like Louisville, Kentucky, that people really deeply care. The one exception was Breonna Taylor. But beyond that, about people who are in altercations with the police and get injured or killed. And the question is that good or bad? And I think the default is supposed to be today it's bad. I think that's been the human norm pretty much forever.
Well, there have been some bad shootings, and for a long time, I actually thought that was the focus, and then I realized most of the people protesting, it was a bit disingenuous, and they were against policing, and they were just using whatever they could get their hands on. But even if you want to look at bad shootings, and I've seen some bad ones. I mean, the one in Paradise, California, where I don't know if you know the overtone vehicle and the cop shoots the guy like whack-a-mole. It shocks the conscious. Guy, I think it was Oklahoma City, gets killed, who's threatening to light himself on fire with lighter fluid, so they light him up. Like what? So, um, I mean, they're out there, but I couldn't figure out why some get traction and some don't. But they're few, and we're talking dozens of a year. But it'd be nice. Look, those guys shouldn't have been shot. So let's focus on what could stop it. And it wasn't. But you have to then get away from an exclusive race lens when you see every situation.
Yeah. Just one quick comment. I would say the traction almost always is not organic. You almost have to be told this is bad, and then get the flames going. But it's rarely organic.
And it's interesting because there hasn't been a notable, bad police shooting, like, and they're still, they're still happening in exactly the same number, which isn't that high, but it's not never. And I don't know. Now people are worried about something else.
The last one that I recall was in South Carolina, where the officer had the guy run, and he just ran and he just shot him in the back. And this would have been probably 2010s. I don't recall exactly when it was, but it was probably between 2011 and 2014.
Yeah, it was in North Charleston, I think,
Yeah, and like that one, if there was one to protest, that was it, and it just didn't. It didn't take the George Floyd or Michael Brown or any of the others.
But you know why George
Floyd?
Floyd?
Things there very quickly before, like, obviously next question to Brooks, but like one would be just obviously like race played a huge role. Like when I looked at this for Taboo, like shootings of black people basically were 20 or 30 times more likely to be reported on like first 100 pages of Google than shootings of whites or Hispanics. The second thing, and this is just my personal conspiratorial nature, but it feels like people intentionally ignored the cases that everyone agreed on that could have been used to get to reasonable reforms. Like Philando Castile is the one that sticks out to me, where this guy like managed the lunch program for a Montessori school. Great guy. He's driving home with his girl. He gets shot because he's pulling out his legal gun to show it to the cop.
I have a gun. Usually, if you want to kill a cop, you don't announce you have a gun.
Yeah, I have a gun. I'm taking it out slowly. What'd you say? I mean, now, interestingly, the officer thought that this guy was the robber in a violent liquor store robbery that had just happened, if you read into the case, which I think we all have. But yeah, that's an indefensible case. There was no pursuit of that because the outcome would be the cop going to jail for a few years, a few minor disciplinary changes, and that's it. So the idea was that we're going to focus on these extreme cases and try to change the things that would make that impossible, which would be things like having police officers. But Brooks Crenshaw, what do you think? What's your question about police?
I want to jump in with a comment first. Previously, Peter, you mentioned the McKinsey comes in and for some reason has to tell them the thing that they know to do. From an incentive standpoint, it's so they have somebody else to blame for telling them the thing if it goes wrong. So from an incentive structure standpoint, you've had a lot of commentary on the prison industrial system and the war on drugs and its efficacy or non. I'd really just kind of like to turn you loose with your understanding of the incentive structure and the perverse incentives in either of those issues, because I think the listeners will get a lot out of that.
It seems almost like ancient history since we were talking a lot about the war on drugs. I mean, that's that when I was in Baltimore. I mean, the city was making 100,000 arrests a year. Now I think it's a fraction. And a lot of that was locking up junkies roaming around. Now, I never took the war on drugs personally, but I did approach it very much as a quality of life issue, that if I lived on this block, what would I want me to do? And the answer was always just get people to shut up. Like, we're trying to sleep here. And you're shouting and breaking bottles and having a little party. And so I personally approached it as a quality of life issue. I also felt that at some point it was leading to mass incarceration. Not directly. It wasn't it wasn't the drug addict who was getting years in prison, but the drug dealers who would then eventually shoot somebody, and they'd go to prison for murder or attempted murder for a long time. So that was real. But then things did start getting better. Crime went down, drug arrests went down, incarceration went down. I mean, so I think it did become less of an urgent, and marijuana has been legalized in a lot of places, so that takes some of it away. Uh, but and then of course, with manpower shortages and so on, I think cops don't have as much time to do that kind of patrol. But yeah, I there's a weird thing where I know it's futile to police drug coroners to some extent, but it's still better than not policing them. Because that's what happened in Baltimore in 2015 and a lot of other cities in 2020. And like literally overnight, shootings doubled. It was sort of that simple. I felt I was having a bigger impact probably than I realized, because my thought was, look, I pull up, they walk away. I drive away, they come back. But you know what? That's better than them staying there all the time saying I'm king of the corner. At least I was exerting authority over the criminals, which, working people in the neighborhood see that the drug dealers weren't in charge. I was. And that there is, there's some benefit in that.
Fair enough. Brooks, you got any follow-up thoughts there?
No, that's good info. I mean, it's good gouge. One of the questions that I also had with regard to the flogging situation from one of your previous books, like, I get the point, and it's a good one. Are you using that as is the flogging literal in the sense that that could be a tenable policy in as an alternative to the 5-year sentence getting the 10 lashes?
So I probably should explain what In Defense of Flogging is about. It's a pretty short book, and the basic gambit is, if you're convicted of a crime, and you were given the choice between 5 years in prison or 10 Singapore-style lashes, which would you choose? And pretty much everyone would choose the lash. But we don't allow that because it's considered cruel and inhumane, and probably is, and racist, and goes back to the legacy of slavery. So it's beyond the pale for us. So instead, we have a system which is actually worse. And I say worse because everyone would choose the whip over years in prison. So the argument is really, like, let's at least be honest about what prison is. It's punishment. And I believe there should be punishment. And I think from the political left, that's a huge absence, is they don't believe in punishment. You do something wrong, you get punished for it. Now, it shouldn't destroy your life. I mean, unless it's a super horrible crime. But it should be some form of punishment. But so if we focused just on punishment and kind of got away from all the bullshit about rehabilitation and the fact that prison is good for people, probably is good for some people, by the way, but in mass, it's not good. People generally don't leave prison better than they go into prison. It's a horrible place. So let's be honest about punishment and figure out a more humane way to punish that still does punish people, but it doesn't have to be prison necessarily. There are some people that are dangerous. They should be kept away from us. Okay. It's just, yeah, it's just trying to peel away the sort of layers of, I don't know whether it's like rose tinted glasses or just, they're going to deal with the problem. But let's be honest about what prison does. Now, since I've written that book, prison population's gone down. So I think that's good. I've become a little more pro incarceration since that book, but I'm more pro jail. Like, that's what's changed, is people aren't going to jail after being arrested. I think prison sentences probably in general should be shorter. Okay, but my God, now you're getting people who are robbing people on the streets, and they're not spending a night in jail. That's the craziness that's happened.
Yeah, it just as a note there, I think a lot of this gets into dueling questions of morality. Like, one of my personal opinions is that excessively moral people cause far more damage to society than sort of mildly amoral business people and soldiers. I mean, there are a lot of things, and this is a very serious point. I mean, there are a lot of things that are just extremely obvious. Like Bukele in El Salvador said, if I lock up young men within this range that have active gang tattoos on their faces, crime will drop. And you could make life almost utopian by doing things of this kind, just not punching yourself in the face. You can debate some of the stuff that really is at the ethical limits, embryo modification and so on, but in general, it would not be very difficult to dramatically improve the world. And I notice far more often people are coming up with woke or religious or whatever else objections to the things that would actually do this, and this is causing harm, than that bad people in the business world or something are causing harm. And I think the leftist take on this, and again, you guys can jump in and criticize my pop philosophy anytime you want, but I think like the leftist take on this is that there's no moral difference in value between any number of people. So, like, I've talked about mass migration with friends, and they've said, well, it's obviously going to be terrible for the United States, but it's going to be very, very good for the people that get in from like Puntland and Eritrea and so on. So the net impact is going to be good. And the response would just be, well, don't you value, say, American women more than young men from Puntland? And their answer is no. And I think that's the same thing that comes up here. Like, punishment is difficult to discuss because it implies that you might cause harm to someone that's greater than the benefit to society, however you want to look at that. Most people don't have an issue doing that because they view the person who's going to prison as criminal scum. So the idea that you would punish people who are criminal scum seems kind of healthy. Did you actually read the new paper that came out where they argue there's a massive unvetted cost to prison, and it's the pain of the people that are in prison?
I mean, I know the argument. Yeah.
I'm not making this up. Well, you've heard this in serious conferences and stuff. I mean, like, but yes, this paper argued, of course, prison saves society X amount of money. Of course, it takes rapists off the street and so on. But we have to understand the pain of the rapist. And they attempted to calculate kind of the pain of the rapist, like how much each person suffers in prison, so on down the line. And I think there are people that really feel this way. It's unusual to me, but honorable in its way.
Well, you can tie this. I mean, I'm very pro-immigrant, and I assume to the left of the three of you politically, but I forget who it was. But someone said, if Democrats, paraphrasing probably, if Democrats can't figure out how to secure the border, the fascists will. The same thing could be applied to public safety. And coming from the political left, I was shouting into this void of, we can't abdicate public safety. And when murder started dropping in El Salvador, I was like, well, yeah, he's doing it in a probably immoral way, in a way we can't do given our Constitution and perhaps our ethics. But let's not deny that it's working, in the sense that crime's going down. And because he wasn't doing it the right way, we were supposed to ignore it until we couldn't ignore it anymore. And so, I think you could get a lot of the benefit without throwing everyone in a horrible prison forever. And but the left won't even debate it. So you get a almost deserved backlash to people who are paying attention to these issues.
Christy Kelly, what do you feel about this moral conversation we just had, or any other question you might want to ask?
Yeah,
What's
I
on your
don't
mind?
know if we can ever really get like true criminal justice reform just because of this. I mean, our prisons really are breeding grounds to make better criminals. So that's one issue. I mean, are we able to get somewhere where they can actually be rehabilitated? I mean, that's not happening in prison, by and large. You put them in there and they come out, with more skills than they went in, and not the good kind of skills, right? And then we talk about, the juveniles, right? Those are some of the worst facilities, is the juvenile detention centers, who they just, again, go in and come out worse. If we talk about now, we have a lot of children that are being even tried as adults. Like, what do we do about those? So I hear you, Will, on one hand, when you're saying we can't have as much empathy for criminals because they're criminals, but then it's a kind of a slippery slope when we are talking about such large numbers of people. I mean, we really do incarcerate a lot of people, and we don't do it very well, and it's costly. So I don't know how we're ever going to have, criminal justice reform, but I do agree 100% with what Peter said. We need to start with actually gelling offenders. if somebody does something, it's no more, ticketing them or, having this kind of revolving door where they go in and they're out, or we're not charging them at all right now in some of the liberal cities. So I think if we start there with having stiffer penalties, but I don't know what the fix is.
I would say not stiffer penalties necessarily, but penalties. They don't have to be they have to be consistent. They have to be certain. And there's another thing is that is often good for the offender because, okay, maybe they do spend a night in jail and it's cold. Okay. But then they don't do it again. I mean, deterrence is not fiction. And if you keep saying nothing's going to happen, and then, then suddenly again, there's a shooting and now there's a dead person and the shooter gets locked up for life and 2 lives are ruined. And you can nip some of that in the bud. The goal has to be you're trying to police behavior. You're trying to change people. I even quibble, this is more semantic, but I don't even like the term rehabilitation because what are you rehabilitating someone back to? Often, like the family life was horrible. The neighborhood was bad. I just want to say we need to help people. Let's be
Mhm.
honest. Yeah, there's some behavioral and even cultural changes that may have to be made. But ultimately, all I want you to do is not hurt somebody else. You do that, we'll help you. You hurt somebody, we punish you.
I did have one kind of burning question, since you did say you are probably to the left of us. One thing that I agree with Will is we can't have as much sympathy for criminals who shouldn't be here in the first place, right? So if we're talking about whether they're on a visa or whether they're just straight illegals that are here or whether they're immigrants that haven't fully become citizens, do you believe that there should be as much tolerance for them if they commit a crime?
If they commit a crime, no. And this is again, I think, a problem with the left. But I, I live in New York City. I live in Queens. It's one of the most immigrant, heavy places in America, and it's part of the reason I live here. It does make the area better. Um, but yeah, if you once you commit a crime, screw you, get out of here. But I do want more immigrants, and of course, some of those immigrants are going to do bad. You take any group, and X number of people do bad. I actually find a strange parallel between sort of the right's fixation on here's an immigrant who, whatever, killed somebody. Therefore, we have to deport all immigrants. It's very similar to the ACAB crowd, which is, look, here's a video of a cop doing something bad. All cops are bastards. Um, I mean, no, you criticize people who do bad, but this sort of collective punishment. Um, reasonable people can differ, but I think both morally and selfishly for America, more immigrants are good. But yeah, some of them are going to do bad things, and then I lose sympathy for them really quickly.
Yeah, I mean,
But I do
there's
want to, I
also a
mean, I also
three-part
believe in due
line there, right?
process. I mean,
Like,
that's just, to take it in a slightly more current political reality. Like, you got to make sure you're deporting the right person, damn it. And you have to and you can't put him in that prison in El Salvador. I mean, oh, we make a mistake and they laugh about it. I mean, that's files. That's file stuff.
and I think you are a little bit to the left of me and maybe Brooks on that. I mean, obviously, there should be an effort to arrest the guy who was sent to El Salvador, arguably mistakenly, had been involved in a pretty serious human trafficking investigation, was just from street level commentary, like a member of the gang he's accused of being a member of, was an illegal immigrant. So the question, I guess, there really is one of those questions of empathy. Like, in that situation, if he has technically been sent to the wrong house of detention, are you going to put out the effort of society to a level where senators are going to meet with the guy? And that's an individual decision I think different people might make differently. I
If I look, I think the deportation is administrative. I mean, due process is. I just want to make clear. I don't mean the guy gets a full trial for everything. There's probable cause. That and make sure you have the right person. There is something uniquely horrendous about that prison in El Salvador that I think. I mean, has anyone ever gotten out of it? I don't think so. Will anyone ever get out of it? Uh, you know that what we just. I don't know. I'm not willing to send the guy to a life in a life in a gulag. I think we have to, there has to be some, I don't know what, but that prison's unique. That's all I'm saying.
How was he
uh,
having margaritas with the senator?
I think that was photoshopped. That was
no, they let
AI.
him out for a day, and I mean I'm sure Bukele is perfectly capable of saying, say certain things and I'll kill you. I mean, he was probably released for a pleasant day, and then he was taken back to, the giant fortress on the hillside. I kind of agree with you, Peter, on some of this. Like, obviously, ideal incarceration isn't giant fortresses on the hillside, but this is one of those where, I mean, you mentioned that the alternatives often seem to be crazy leftism or fascism light. An unfortunate reality is that everyone's going to pick fascism light. Like, if the options are 12 million people just wandering across the border, and like Chinese and Nigerian guys standing at obvious parade rest at the border, or every so often we deport an illegal alien human trafficker to the wrong place, everyone's going to pick number two. I don't even pretend a moment of faux guilt about it. But Brooks Crenshaw, do you? Or do you want to say something else?
Well, so no, I tend toward the latter option. I mean, that's the rub, right? I think we're
Peter's right. We want the correct option, right?
well,
there's a vast center here, so
yeah, and that's where I think we all should meet. I think on the right we're going to be dealing with the same issues that the left has had in the last 15 years. In that, the Barry Weisses and the Brett Weinsteins that were on the left, but they actually believed in the tenets of ballot box and free speech. And then when everybody around them just went the other way, they were like, hey, wait a minute, I actually believe in this. And that put them on my side of the line. I think as the right gets more protracted power, there will be people on our side that are, and we're seeing it now. We're seeing some of the things that, I think you're alluding to, Peter. And that needs to be controlled for and to maintain a better center. One of the things in the immigration debate that, having traveled a lot and having worked in a lot of third world countries, or at least more than most, there are cultures that are largely incompatible with America, with our system. And I'll give you an anecdote, which isn't, scientific, but before 9/11, before I joined the military, I was a police science major, and we had a refugee in our class. He was from Sierra Leone, and he'd had a rough upbringing. There was a rebellion uprising force there, RUF, which was the teens that would raid a village and kill all the adults and recruit all the teens, and on to the next village they would go. And he got caught up into that as a very young teen, and then found a way here. And we were all going to lunch and talking about our weekend and what we were going to be doing. And he kind of sneaks into the conversation at the restaurant and says, hey, you guys like to rape girls? And we were like, what'd you just say to me? And he said it again. And we were like, you'll get killed for doing that here, by us, like by the people around you. And so he was dissuaded from that, but like that was normal where he's from. And so
Wow.
looking at that, there are dominant cultures outside the castle walls that you have to look at to see if the average bear that's coming from there is going to participate in that. And I think that's part of the debate, especially when you're talking about Trinidad de Agua and other gang members that are obviously here for multiple reasons, and were let in over the last administration. I don't believe that about most foreigners, but I do believe that about certain cultures that behavior is prevalent. And so I think we have to look at that as a factor in who we let in.
I mean, I can't argue with that. I would say that there's a problem in that the people who are, am I allowed to cuss at will?
Absolutely.
Oh, there are people who are more fucked up who, because of trauma of what he went, like what a, he lived through one of the worst episodes of, human history in the past decade. His claim to asylum is greater, and yeah, he's going to be fucked up because of what he went through. So I don't know how you sort of reconcile that you want to help the people who went through what he did, and you also have to accept the fact that what he went through does not help matters.
Right. Yeah, and that's the delicate line, because we're both telling the truth. It's just which truth stacks higher in the
What I
hierarchy.
was saying, of course, that's such an extreme case. Also maybe he's just a rapist. We have a homegrown rapist too. Like maybe it's unrelated to the trauma that he suffered, though I doubt it.
Seems
Um,
very unlikely,
very,
though, that
very unlikely,
someone.
but it's not like we don't have homegrown rapists. But I will say, in terms of even cultures that are less compatible with American or European Enlightenment liberal values, uh, you know what? Their children assimilate just fine. Like that's what you see in New York City. Yeah, maybe the parents never even learn English, but I teach their kids, and they become Americans. So
Yeah, I
Well,
agree
I think
in the
again, this
long term
gets
sense, in the
into that.
generational sense. Yeah,
This gets into
that
that sort of ordo amoris sense of what do you value most, though, right? So, like, and I really do think there's a moral split here that's roughly as we've all defined it. Like, if you view all humans exactly equally, then sure, if someone's had a terrible life, it's very tempting to let him into your country as an asylee so one person can have a better life, even if he might commit one injurious or fatal crime during his time here. I think that this is not traditionally how people have thought. People have throughout almost all of history said, I value, say, again, the example used earlier was American women more than foreign fighting men. And so the idea of doing this is completely absurd. And I would fall in that tradition. Like, I think, again, a lot of this is just don't punch yourself in the face, right? Like, if some guy comes from a country where the war that defined the place for 20 years involved cannibalism and says, I'd like to come to your country to live a better life, you always have the option of just saying no. Well, fuck yourself. I mean, like, you don't have to be nice.
you
Like,
don't have to,
we
but
made
isn't
up
it
all
better to
these
be
rules.
nice? I mean, why be cruel by choice?
Well, I think it depends what you. Well, I think Peter, actually, you're one of the people that's illustrated this probably best to me. Cruelty is a relative thing. Like, I probably wouldn't actually say go fuck yourself on an asylum application. It's unfortunately we don't have enough space in the Brooklyn men's consulate or
You
whatever.
have your GFY stamp, chunk.
I mean, but but the whole point though is when you talk about cruelty, like I think a lot of people would view it as cruel to admit someone who's 90% likely to commit a rape into the USA, where rape kits are one of the things that not. I mean, this is one of my feminist points. So, like, rape kits are one of the things police departments most lag on, very famously, blah blah blah. Like a lot of people are going to suffer because of that. So the question is, do you care more about the Sierra Leonean community or about the people that are going to be victims of them in this country? And it's probably a roughly equivalent number of people. Most people aren't going to commit 35 rapes. So again, if you think all humans are exactly equal in terms of how you should rate them, it's a very tough question.
Yeah, maybe there's
I just
something to be
don't.
said for
Uh,
trial by ordeal instead of asylum as the main source of immigrant. I mean, if you can walk across the Darien Gap, maybe that means you're of more moral fortitude than someone simply filing an asylum claim. I don't know. I just worry about people I know who are immigrants, legal and otherwise. That are my neighbors and students and so on. So I want what's best for them. They, by the way, are very clear that they don't like they don't want the criminals either.
yeah, I think sometimes we are very middle, upper middle class, and we forget the obvious. I mean, the obvious argument with Biden kind of just opening the gate and letting way too many people in is we're not doing a great job of taking care of our citizens. So the people that are poor, lower class are like the audacity of, us letting all of these immigrants in, plopping them in south side of Chicago, taking over, their schools, their resources. They're having to fight when we're not doing a good job. I mean, we have, veterans and homeless and, you know, people on drugs that we're not taking care of. We can't absorb this, not to mention the United States is in debt. We're talking about we can't afford, the safety rails on our own system. How can we afford to absolve scores of immigrants? So I think sometimes because we are the status that we are and they're not living next to us, that we sometimes forget the obvious argument.
Yeah, I mean, and politically, it was disastrous for people who supported those policies. I mean, I think New York did handle it better than Chicago. I mean, Chicago, yeah, you had refugees, migrants, sleeping in police station on the floors of police stations there. Um, but then there's also, God, what a corrupt enterprise! All the contracts to help people. I mean, it's amazing how quickly People were so ready to, provide half-ass services on no-bid contracts and so on. And so it wasn't all about doing the right thing. But I think you might get that in other crisis situations as well. But that was certainly part of it, was there was a lot of money to be made.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, Chicago, although I'll defend the city to New Yorkers and San Franciscans and so on, is legendary for corruption. I mean, if you go back to Chicago on a business trip, I mean, there's still migrants sleeping at O'Hare Airport and so on. I mean, the city really hasn't processed that population at all. And I mean, there's almost an element of dark humor to this. Like you've traveled for 1,000 miles across Central America to come to the United States, where all the streets are paved with gold, and you get to the border and they say you're taking you to your destination and they put you on an El Conejo bus to the south side of Chicago in the projects. I mean, like, there are people that have been interviewed by the Tribune that have said, this is not a substantially better quality of living than I had at home. To which
Did
the
you see them
response,
protesting? They were
yeah,
protesting.
no, I mean, and the response of a lot of Black and Irish Chicagoans was like, okay, you think we live in the hood? Go back to Guatemala. I mean, but it definitely was not well handled. But okay, I guess the next question here, I mean, one thing we haven't really talked about, we brought it up at the beginning of the show. This is kind of the core theme of your work, the impact of policing on crime and what led to these crime drops. New York City, even as a Chicagoan, it's kind of the archetypal example of this. During the Giuliani Dinkins era, crime went from world leading to one of the lowest per capita levels in the country. So what did cause the crime drop? How can policing dramatically reduce crime, and how does New York illustrate that?
It the shortest answer, as silly as it sounds, and I'll elaborate, is it was a mission statement as they started caring about crime. And you might go, what? But they didn't, the anecdote I give is in 94, when Bratton became NYPD commissioner, his right-hand man, a former transit lieutenant by the name of Jack Maple, asked police, high-up police execs, police chiefs, how many people were shot last year? Last year being 1993. And nobody knew. The NYPD did not know how many people were shot in New York City. That's unfathomable today. We still don't know how many people were shot in 1990. The most violent year was probably close to 7,000, by the way. They just weren't keeping track. So they started keeping track, and they said, why don't we care about crime? That's why Back from the Brink starts earlier, because I need to show the dysfunction of the city and the police department. And the NYPD cared about corruption, cared about brutality, cared about race riots, cared about making 3 or 4 robbery arrests for every 10 robberies. You needed some clearance on robberies for some reason, just robberies. You did that, you were fine. And nobody cared about crime. And when I say nobody, I don't mean no. Of course some cops did, but institutionally there was no focus on crime. And Bratton said, we're going to change that. We're going to focus on crime, fear, crime, and disorder. And the results were so instantaneous. And I mean, after that comes the hard work, of course. You can't just snap your fingers. But if you don't care about it, it's not going to happen. And what they did is they got the data, first of all. I mean, that's the first step. And that, became known as the ComStat. But when I started doing the interviews for Back from the Brink, and to be clear, it's all interviews of other people. It's mostly cops, but there are some business leaders, there prosecutor, and so. But I'm telling the police side of the story, because they tell the story really well. And it was saying, okay, you're the precinct commander. You tell us what tools you need. You bring down crime. And if you don't bring down crime, you better have a plan B right away. And if you don't care, then you're going to lose your job. It could have been done in many different ways, but that was the way they did it. And what do you know? It's not that hard, because there are not that many criminals out there compared to, at the time, NYPD was pushing 40,000 cops. I mean, that's a lot of cops. Let's go get them. We got, there's 5,000 shootings in 1994. Well, we got more than 5,000 detectives, for crying out loud. And some of it was just, basic. You want to go and arrest people who have warrants. There wasn't a lot of willpower to do that. Make sure that the specialized units are actually working during the hours when the crime happens, because crime doesn't just happen 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. I mean, there was some low-hanging fruit. And then, of course, different crimes require different strategies, but it was revolutionary. And, next year, Bratton was on the cover of Time magazine. Other departments were following suit. And then, of course, Bratton got fired because Giuliani could handle no competition in the ego department. But they went, yeah, from 2,200 murders, eventually to less than 300. I mean,
Wow.
that's an amazing drop. And those lessons of stay focused on crime. I would take good leadership over more cops, but when you have fewer, you're not going to do more with less. They got under Dinkins, they got a big bill passed, Safe Streets, Safe City, that hired a lot of cops. Because New York was still reeling from the financial crisis back in 75 when cops got laid off. And that destroyed the department for a decade.
Fair enough. Any comments or questions from you, Brooks, or from Christy?
I did have a quick question. How do you feel about the show us your papers or the stop and frisk? Do you think that actually helped cut down
Um,
on crime?
no, I want to distinguish it from broken windows because it's often conflated. Um, so under Bloomberg and Kelly, and it's ironic because it happened in response to a lawsuit where the NYPD finally had to keep accurate count of stops. When I was a cop, there was a stop form. We just usually didn't fill it out because nobody cared, and it was paperwork. So once stops became quantifiable, suddenly more became better, and it peaked around 2004 with 100,000 stops, reported stops. They were probably over-reporting them because it was considered a productivity measure. But what's interesting is violence wasn't going down during that time because they weren't stopping the right people. Now, it is a tool, and used well, it's an effective tool. But the tail starts wagging the dog on things like that in police departments because of the lack of the leadership saying, let's stay focused on crime. So because of a lawsuit, stops dropped dramatically, 95% or something. Bratton, that was during Bratton's second term as commissioner. Murders dropped again. So we know that in hindsight, at least, that it wasn't necessary. But that doesn't, in a way, like cops took the wrong lessons from broken windows to some extent, and then the anti-cop people took the wrong lessons from stop, question, and frisk. It was bad. It hurt policing. I had students being stopped, and they'd say, "Well, why aren't they stopping the drug dealers? Why are they stopping me?" I was like, "Well, because you're easy and you're compliant, and you want to get to school, and you're not carrying a gun." So it was misused, but that doesn't mean police shouldn't stop people on real, reasonable suspicion. That's their job, is to get up in your business. And yes, sometimes innocent people will be stopped. And, if you live in a high crime neighborhood, then in a way, you are double victimized. But you can keep it to a minimum. You can be at least polite to the people. Yeah, it's, I mean, I'm thinking of now in the context of people trying to end police stops together and end pretextual car stops and things like that because they're trying to end policing. So you need stops, but you do need some accountability, and you have to figure out why you're doing it. What's the goal here? Is it part of a strategy? Louis Anemone, who ran Comstat with Jack Maple, and I've gotten to know him in the years since. He had such a simple three-pronged test for police policy, but it's a good one. Is it moral? Is it legal? Is it effective? And he said he'd ask those three questions for everything they did. Well, it's a pretty simple, good test of how to do something. And in the 90s, their broken windows approach passed all three. And I think in the 2000s, it didn't, when it morphed into the zero tolerance, stop everybody you can.
Well, your point, I want to interject the point of the stops going up when they were incentivized to do so. Like, that's just classic, consequences of the incentive structure. One thing I'm concerned about as policing continues to mature and there's measure, countermeasure, countermeasure across kind of the gamification of it, is, in Nashville, I'll give you an example. There was this incentive structure blind spot where they made altering a temporary tag a felony. So you take a magic marker and turn a 2 into a 12, you're now a felon. And so in the incentive structure of officer safety versus felony arrest, you want both. every precinct, every shift meeting was, we need more of these arrests. We need more of these arrests. And they were pushing the cops to go specifically after those because they were such easy, incentive scratches, scratches to the itch. And so like, I worry about those types of policies being I tend to think fewer laws are better, as we make more and more activity illegal, then that becomes the incentive structure. And you've kind of touched on the fact that when you incentivize numbers to go up, guess what? They go up.
Yeah, I mean, you said it well. You're absolutely right. You have to have the right incentives, and you have to, but that's where the leadership comes in. You know, you have to stay focused on crime, but there's no way you can pass a law saying, I wish we could pass a law saying we need good leaders. So you absolutely have to be careful. And we don't seem to tinker and improve things. You go from something like that, and then on the other side, you get cities that say you can't pull over a car for fake tags. And it's like, well, talk about incentivizing the wrong things there.
Right.
Um, but then why are people modifying tags? I don't mind them stopping it. Yeah. Uh, for a long time, I thought maybe it would be better if police departments really, I mean, they would still keep track of arrests, but like if they didn't use it as, like you ask a cop, how many people did you arrest in the last, 4-week period? They can tell you. I've asked cops that in other countries and they honestly don't know. Like they can go back and say, oh, 1, 2, 3, oh, 4, which would be a lot, by the way. But, and I thought maybe that's better that they're not judged on it. But now I'm looking at policing getting back into the game in the past few years, and I can't help but look at arrests as a proxy for police activity. But it's not that arrests are good. It's a measure of something. It's a tool. But are you arresting the right people is always the question that needs to be asked.
Oh, that's actually a great closing point as we hit exactly 10 p.m. I mean, there's obviously a huge human element to this, which is one of the things that makes policing, law, and so on so unique. You're out there every day working with humanity, usually in the worst day they're going to have for a while. Um, I mean, I've done a lot of talking here, so I don't really actually have a closing note, but we're gonna go around the panel, I guess. Christy Kelly, what's your final take on this discussion of policing for good and ill?
Well, I think it's been a good discussion, and I think Peter is going to help restore our faith. He didn't exactly say he was a liberal. He said he was to the left of us, but that's what
Proud
we need.
states.
We need sensible moderates, liberals, like bring back sensible ones that don't want to completely end policing. So I think that this was, restored my hope, Peter.
Thank you, Christy.
Oh, thank you. That's the nicest thing Christy Kelly has ever said to one of our guests. You've restored her hope. Look at that. Look at this gentleman. Look at this lion. All right, Brooks Crenshaw, what do you have to say?
You have restored my hope as well, Peter. I just want you to know that. No, I really appreciate your inputs and your work to date. It's an important conversation. I think incentive has a lot to do with it. I think a lot of this is upstream. We've mentioned family problems in glancing parts of the conversation, but I tend to think that is the greatest upstream problem, to quote the great Thomas Sowell, that every successive generation is in effect an invasion of barbarians that must be tamed in time. And I think we're a little behind there. And I think that some of that is, once you go down that road, you end up in interactions with the state, and then we have to have your conversation. But I really appreciate your contribution to the study and to the work.
Thanks, Brooks.
Oh, all right. And Peter Moskos, what's your final thought? What should be done with American policing? Where wither the country? This sort of thing.
Start with the premise that policing is essential, and then figure out how to make it better. And right now my mind's entirely on just plugging my book. Read it; it's good. You read it. You'll
What is your book? Tell the
My
decent
book
sized
is
audience where.
Back from the Brink: Inside the NYPD and New York City's Extraordinary 1990s Crime Drop. It's not an academic tome. It's a narrative. It's meant to be a good read first and foremost, but you learn a bit of history, and the lessons are very applicable to today.
Boom. That is Back from the Brink by Peter Moskos. That's available at Amazon, wherever you might buy fine books. Always check out and patronize a local bookseller. And all right, for the Cut the Bull team, I'm Will Reilly. Have a great night.
I got a country to say. Patriot J, I'm saving the day. Patriot J, I'm saving the day from you commies who lame. No, you can't fuck with me. I got a country to say. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to say, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.